The cold did not just seep into the cabin, it lived there. It settled deep into the chinking between the logs and frosted the iron nails of the floorboards until they gleamed like dull silver in the dark. Elara woke before the sun, as she had every morning since the world had frozen over. The air in the room was sharp enough to cut. Her breath plumed above her in the pitch black, a pale ghost hovering over the heavy wool blankets. She did not move at first. She lay perfectly still, listening to the vast, crushing silence of the Montana Territory. It was a silence so profound, it rang in her ears, broken only by the sudden violent crack of a frozen tree branch snapping somewhere deep in the timber. She threw off the blankets. The shock of the frigid air hit her skin like a physical blow. There was no time to shiver. Shivering wasted energy. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress, her bare feet finding the icy planks of the floor. She moved by memory in the darkness, pulling on thick wool stockings, a heavy cotton dress stiff with the cold, and a woolen shawl she wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her fingers were clumsy numb at the joints as she fumbled with the wooden buttons. The hearth was completely black. She knelt before it, her knees protesting against the hard stone. She pushed aside the dead, powdery gray ash with an iron poker, searching for a spark. Deep beneath the ruin of last night's fire, a single stubborn ember pulsed with a faint, angry orange light. It was enough. She fed it a handful of dry pine needles. She leaned in close, her cheek almost touching the soot-stained stones, and blew softly. The smoke rose first bitter and stinging her eyes, carrying the scent of ancient resin. Then the flame caught. She fed the fire, kindling, then heavier splits of oak, watching as the yellow light slowly pushed the shadows back into the corners of the one-room cabin. She fed the fire, kindling, then heavier splits of oak, watching as the yellow light slowly pushed the shadows back into the corners of the one-room cabin. But the heat would take hours to reach the walls. She turned to the wash basin. The water she had poured the night before was a solid block of ice. She took the heavy handle of her hunting knife and brought it down hard. The ice shattered with a sharp fracture. She scooped the shards into the iron kettle and hung it over the growing flames. Every morning was a war against the frost. She had fought it alone for 2 winters now. There was no one to complain to. No one to share the burden of the axe, no one to divide the endless chores that kept death at bay. There was only the work and the quiet. While the water heated, she pulled on her heavy canvas coat lined with sheepskin and shoved her feet into stiff leather boots. She tied a wool scarf over her ears and pulled on thick leather gloves. She lifted the wooden latch of the heavy oak door and pushed. It stuck frozen to the sill. She threw her shoulder against it. The door gave way with a loud groan, and the outside world rushed in. The wind hit her like a wall of water, stealing the breath from her lungs. The sky above the jagged tree line was the color of a bruised plum, dark and threatening. The air smelled like snow, not the light drifting flakes of early winter, but the heavy suffocating whiteout of a true high-country blizzard. It was coming fast. The wind was already whipping the loose powder from the ground, sending it swirling in angry, hissing spirals across the yard. She lowered her head and stepped off the porch, leaning her weight into the gale. The snow crunched loudly under her boots, a dry squeaking sound that meant the temperature was dropping fast. She made her way to the barn, her eyes narrowed against the stinging wind. Inside, the air was marginally warmer, smelling rich and earthy, with the scent of hay manure and horse flesh. Her 2 draft horses nickered softly at her approach, their breath steaming in the dim light. She worked quickly, her movements practiced and efficient. She pitched hay into their mangers, checked their water troughs, and broke the thin layer of ice that had formed over the surface. The wind began to howl outside, a high, mournful sound that rattled the wooden shingles of the barn roof. The timber groaned under the sudden immense pressure. The storm had arrived. She knew she had to get back to the cabin before the whiteout swallowed the distance between the buildings entirely. She secured the barn doors, dropping the heavy wooden crossbar into place. When she turned back toward the cabin, the world was gone. There was no sky, no trees, no mountains. There was only a chaotic, swirling void of white. The snow drove in horizontally, blinding her, stinging her face like buckshot. She kept her head down blindly, entrusting her internal compass, counting her paces. 10 steps, 20 steps. The wind roared, deafening her to all other sounds. 30 steps. She should have hit the porch stairs by now. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her chest. Then a shadow detached itself from the blinding white wall. She stopped, her hand instinctively dropping to the heavy revolver belted at her waist beneath her coat. Through the driving snow, the shape slowly solidified. It was a man. He was moving toward the cabin, but his gait was entirely wrong. He dragged one foot heavily, his body leaning forward as if pushing against an invisible weight. He wore no heavy winter coat, only a buckskin shirt darkened by melting snow and tall moccasins that reached his knees. A thick woolen blanket was wrapped tightly around his shoulders, dusted entirely in white. He did not see her. He stumbled toward the side of the cabin, seeking the small overhang of the roof for shelter. He collapsed against the log wall, his knees giving out, sliding down until he sat in the deepening snowdrift. His head dropped forward onto his chest. Elara stood frozen in the storm. She knew the dangers of the territory. She knew the absolute finality of a high country blizzard. To leave a man outside in this was murder, regardless of who he was. She released her grip on the revolver. She fought her way through the wind, stepping up onto the porch and grabbing the collar of his blanket. She hauled him upward. He was heavy, completely spent. He did not resist. He raised his head, his dark eyes meeting hers through the chaos of the storm. His face was weathered, his skin pale beneath the bronze, his lips drawn and blue from the cold. He was Apache. She did not speak. The wind would have torn the words away anyway. She simply kicked the cabin door open, dragged him over the threshold, and shoved the heavy oak door shut against the howling world outside. The sudden silence of the cabin was deafening. The fire cracked cheerfully in the hearth, throwing warm yellow light across the floorboards. The man slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow and ragged. Water began to pool around his boots as the snow melted from his clothes. Elara stood by the door, breathing hard, watching him. He slowly lifted his head and looked at the fire, then looked back at her. There was no threat in his eyes, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. He did not ask for anything. He simply sat on the floor, absorbing the heat of the room as if he were drinking it. She unbuttoned her heavy coat, hanging it on the wooden peg by the door. She walked to the hearth, took the iron kettle of boiling water, and poured it into a tin cup over a handful of ground chicory. She walked back across the room and held the steaming cup out to him. He looked at the cup, then at her hand. He reached out. His fingers brushed hers. They were like ice. He took the cup in both hands, letting the heat seep into his palms, and brought it to his lips. Outside, the blizzard raged, trying to tear the roof from the cabin. Inside, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the quiet, steady breathing of the stranger sitting on her floor. Main idea, wary but respectful coexistence during the blizzard. He repays her hearth's warmth by taking over heavy labor, communicating his gratitude through sweat and capability. Target word. Count 1. 000 words. The blizzard screamed for 3 days and 3 nights. It was a living thing clawing at the log walls, searching for a way inside to finish what it had started. Inside the cabin, the air grew thick with the smell of wood smoke, wet wool, and the heavy unspoken tension of 2 strangers sharing a space no larger than a grain wagon. Elara kept to her routine. Routine was the iron anchor that kept madness from drifting in when the world turned white. She mended cracked leather harnesses by the fire, oiled her heavy boots, and cooked simple necessary meals of salt pork and dried beans. The man kept to his corner by the hearth. He slept for the first full day and night, his body demanding a steep payment for the ordeal he had survived. When he finally woke, he watched her. His eyes were obsidian dark, tracking her steady movements with the quiet, unblinking intensity of a hawk perched on a high ridge. He did not speak. She did not ask for his name. Names belonged to a softer world that existed before the snow. Here there was only survival. By the morning of the second day, the wood box beside the cast iron stove was growing perilously low. The heavy cordwood was stacked in the lean-to attached to the back of the cabin, but the massive rounds of oak and hickory still needed splitting. Elara tied her woolen shawl tight across her chest, picked up her iron wedge and the heavy splitting maul, and pushed through the rear door. The air in the lean-to was bone-chilling. Driven snow whistled through the gaps in the rough-hewn siding, accumulating in small powdery drifts on the dirt floor. She dragged a massive oak round onto the scarred chopping block. She planted her feet and raised the maul. It was heavy, a dead weight in her tired arms. Before she could swing, a shadow fell over the block. He was there. He wore his buckskin shirt, his feet soundless in their tall moccasins, completely unfazed by the freezing draft cutting through the shed. He reached out and took the handle of the maul from her hands. It was a smooth, undeniable motion. He did not ask for permission. He did not offer a polite smile. He simply stepped up to the block and measured the distance. The first swing was a revelation of raw, quiet power. The maul came down in a clean, vicious arc. The heavy steel head struck the oak round dead center with a sound like a rifle shot. The wood gave a sharp, explosive crack and fell apart into two perfect halves. Elara stood back, her breath pluming in the freezing air, momentarily caught in her throat. She watched the fluid movement of his shoulders beneath the buckskin, the easy, grounded rotation of his hips. There was no wasted energy, no frantic, angry hacking at the wood. It was a steady, punishing rhythm. The halves became quarters. The quarters became kindling. The sharp, clean scent of freshly split oak filled the freezing air of the lean-to, cutting through the stale smell of winter. It mingled with the faint, earthy scent of his exertion. Within an hour, he had split enough wood to last them a week, stacking the pieces with meticulous geometric precision against the log wall. When he was done, he handed the maul back to her. The hickory handle was still warm from his grip. He nodded once, a sharp, respectful inclination of his head. He was paying his debt for the warmth of her hearth in the only currency that mattered out here: sweat and capability. The true test of their silent barter came on the third night. A sudden violent gust of wind hit the property with the force of a runaway train, shaking the cabin down to its stone foundations. A terrible splintering sound echoed over the howling gale coming from the direction of the stable. Elara's heart seized in her chest. If the stable doors blew in, the freezing wind would sweep through the stalls. Her 2 draft horses would be dead by morning. She dropped her mending, grabbed her tin lantern, and snatched a coil of heavy hemp rope from the wall peg. She turned toward the door, only to find him already standing there. He held a heavy iron hammer and a handful of thick forged nails he had pulled from her tool chest. They ventured out together into the blinding white chaos. The thick guide rope strung between the cabin porch and the stable was their only lifeline in the dark. The wind battered them mercilessly, trying to tear them from the line, driving icy needles into their eyes. When they finally reached the stable, the heavy double doors were thrashing wildly. The iron hinges shrieked in protest against the wood. The heavy oak crossbar had snapped like a dry twig under the pressure of the storm. Inside, the horses were stomping and whinnying in terror as the snow swirled around their hooves. It took both of them throwing their entire body weight against the freezing oak to force the doors shut against the gale. Elara held them closed, her boots slipping on the icy floorboards, her muscles burning and screaming in agony as the wind fought back. He worked with terrifying speed in the flickering, dying light of the lantern. He did not bother searching for a new crossbar. He drove the thick iron nails directly through the heavy iron hasps, embedding them deep into the framing timbers of the barn. Each strike of the hammer was deafening, precise, and absolute. He did not miss. He secured the doors shut with a violent finality that defied the storm. When they finally stumbled back into the cabin, they collapsed against the heavy oak door as Elara barred it behind them. They slid down to the floor, covered head to toe in white snow chests, heaving, gasping for the warm air of the room. The firelight danced across their exhausted faces. He looked at her, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with melting snow and sweat. Elara looked back, her hands trembling from the fading adrenaline. No words were spoken, but the wary, guarded distance between them had subtly, permanently shifted. They had fought the mountain together, and they had won. Main idea. The blizzard passes, but he remains to help her secure the property. She becomes acutely aware of his quiet presence, the scent of wood smoke and leather, and the strange comfort of hearing another set of footsteps. Target word. Count 1. 000 words. The morning broke with a silence so absolute it was heavy enough to crush bone. The ceaseless, violent howling of the wind that had battered the cabin for 3 days was simply gone. In its place was a stillness that felt almost sacred. Elara opened her eyes to a blinding, brilliant light piercing through the thick layer of frost on the single glass window pane. The sun had finally returned to the Montana territory. She rose from her narrow bed, her breath still pluming in the freezing air of the cabin, but the desperate biting edge of the cold had dulled. The storm had blown itself out. She moved to the hearth, but the fire was already built. It was not a roaring inferno, but a steady, perfectly structured pyramid of split oak that radiated a deep, sustained heat. The Apache was gone from his corner. His heavy woolen blanket was folded neatly at the foot of the wall. Elara pulled on her heavy boots and her sheepskin-lined coat, a sudden sharp knot forming in her stomach. The unspoken rules of the frontier dictated that a man moved on when the weather broke. She lifted the heavy wooden latch and pushed the door open. It hit a solid wall of white. The snow had drifted against the front of the cabin, sealing them in beneath 4 feet of tightly packed powder. She grabbed the iron-headed shovel from its peg and began to dig, carving away heavy blocks of snow and tossing them out into the blinding glare of the morning. The air was razor-sharp, burning her lungs with every inhalation, but the physical labor quickly warmed her blood. She broke through the drift and stepped out onto the porch. The world was unrecognizable. The jagged peaks of the mountains were buried under a smooth, unbroken blanket of white. The pine trees bowed under the immense weight of the snow, their dark green needles entirely hidden. She heard him before she saw him. It was the rhythmic metallic scrape of an iron shovel against the frozen earth. She waded through the waist-deep snow toward the stable, her eyes adjusting to the brutal glare of the sun. He was already there. He had dug a clear, wide trench from the barn doors to the water pump, moving the heavy, wet snow with the same methodical, tireless efficiency he had used on the oak rounds. He paused as she approached, leaning his weight on the wooden handle of the shovel, his breath plumed in the crisp air. He wore his buckskin shirt unbothered by the freezing temperature, his dark hair tied back from his face with a strip of rawhide. He did not look like a man preparing to leave. He looked like a man settling into the work of the day. She did not ask him if he was staying. To ask would be to break the fragile, unspoken truce they had built in the dark. She simply picked up a second shovel, leaning against the stable wall, and joined him in the trench. They worked side by side through the morning, clearing the yard, checking the fence lines, and knocking the heavy accumulation of snow off the sagging roof of the lean-to. The silence between them was no longer the wary, heavy quiet of 2 strangers trapped in a box. It was the companionable, steady silence of 2 people engaged in the mutual labor of survival. As the sun climbed higher, casting long blue shadows across the snowdrifts, Elara became acutely aware of his presence in a way she had not been during the blinding chaos of the storm. She noticed the way he moved. There was a deliberate grounding gravity to his steps. He did not fight the terrain. He flowed over it, his tall moccasins finding purchase on the hidden ice beneath the snow. Whenever the wind shifted, it carried his scent toward her. It was a stark, defining smell. It was the scent of old oiled leather, the sharp, clean tang of crushed pine needles, and the deep, rich aroma of wood smoke that seemed baked into his very skin. It was not the stale scent of a man who had been trapped indoors. It was the scent of the wild, untamed mountain itself, tempered by the warmth of a hearth. It was a profoundly grounding smell. She found herself breathing a little deeper when the wind blew her way. By late afternoon, the brutal labor was done. The perimeter was secure, the horses were fed and watered, and the wood box was full. The sky began to turn a deep bruised purple, the temperature plummeting the moment the sun dipped below the jagged ridgeline. They walked back to the cabin together. Elara walked in front, breaking the path through the loose powder that had blown back over their trench. Behind her, she heard the steady, even crunch of his boots in the snow. For 2 brutal winters, Elara had known only the sound of her own existence. She knew the sound of her own breath, the scrape of her own chair against the floorboards, the solitary thud of her own boots on the porch planks. The silence of the homestead had been a physical weight, a constant echoing reminder of her total isolation in a world that did not care if she lived or died. Now, as she stepped up onto the wooden porch and stamped the snow from her boots, a second set of heavy footsteps followed. The thick wooden planks groaned under his weight. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud. She paused her hand on the iron latch of the door. The sound resonated deep in her chest. It was the sound of backup. It was the sound of a shared burden. It was the strange, terrifying, and overwhelming comfort of knowing that if she fell, she was no longer alone in the dark. She pushed the door open, letting the welcoming heat of the cabin wash over them. She stepped inside and held the door open for him. He stepped over the threshold, bringing the scent of the cold, clean pine with him. He took off his heavy outer shirt and hung it on the peg next to her sheepskin coat. The 2 garments rested against each other in the dim light of the fire. He walked to the hearth, picked up the iron poker, and expertly shifted the logs to coax the flames higher. Elara stood by the door for a long moment, watching the firelight dance across the broad, strong line of his shoulders. She realized with a quiet, undeniable certainty that the crushing weight of the frontier did not feel so heavy tonight. Main idea. She wakes before dawn, bracing for the usual biting chill of the cabin, only to find the hearth already roaring and a pot of coffee boiling. It is a profound, quiet revelation. For the first time in her life, someone else has carried the burden of the morning. Target word. Count 1000 words. The human body learns to anticipate pain. For 2 relentless winters, Elara's bones had kept a grim, precise timepiece, waking her an hour before dawn to face the freezing dark. Sleep was never a peaceful surrender. It was a shallow trench dug against the invading frost. Her mind would rouse while her body remained motionless beneath the heavy woolen quilts, gathering the sheer desperate willpower required to throw off the covers and step onto the ice-rimed floorboards. She knew the exact sequence of suffering, the stinging air in her lungs, the numb, clumsy fumbling for the flint, the agonizing wait for the first reluctant spark to catch in the dead ashes. It was a lonely, bitter war fought before the sun ever breached the horizon. This morning the internal clock chimed its silent alarm, pulling her from a deep, dreamless sleep. She lay perfectly still, her eyes closed, bracing her muscles for the inevitable shock of the cold. She waited for the sharp ache in her joints. She waited for the frozen draft to snake across her face. Neither came. Instead, a strange heavy warmth pressed gently against the thick quilts. The air in the cabin did not bite at her nose. It felt thick, soft, and remarkably forgiving. And there was light. Not the pale, ghostly silver of moonlight reflecting off the snow, but a rich, flickering gold that painted the inside of her eyelids. Elara opened her eyes. The shadows of the cabin were dancing. She turned her head slowly on the feather ticking. Across the room the hearth was alive. It was not the desperate, smoky infant of a fire she usually coaxed into existence, but a mature, roaring blaze. Thick logs of split oak were stacked with architectural precision, radiating a fierce, steady heat that chased the winter completely out of the room. The iron grate glowed cherry red. Suspended over the flames, her heavy black iron kettle hissed softly, a plume of white steam rising from the spout. The rich, dark scent of boiling chicory root and roasted grounds filled the cabin, cutting through the lingering smell of wood smoke and old wool. It was the most intoxicating fragrance she had ever known. He was sitting on the wooden stool beside the hearth. He was fully dressed, his buckskin shirt catching the amber light of the fire. His dark hair was loose, falling over his shoulders as he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. In his hands, he held a piece of split pine and a small razor-sharp hunting knife. He was quietly, methodically carving a new latch pin for the stable door. The long, pale ribbons of wood curled away from the blade and fell silently to the stone hearth. He had not woken her. He had not made a sound heavy enough to pull her from her rest. He had simply risen in the absolute pitch black of the freezing frontier morning, taken up the heavy iron poker, and carried the burden of the dawn entirely on his own shoulders. Elara lay there staring at the broad, steady line of his back. A sudden tight ache rose in her throat, entirely foreign and overwhelming. It was not sorrow, and it was not pity. It was the profound, staggering shock of relief. For her entire life on this unforgiving claim, every ounce of survival had rested squarely on her. If she did not chop the wood, she froze. If she did not draw the water, she thirsted. If she did not build the fire, the darkness won. To wake up and find the fire already blazing was a miracle she had never dared to pray for. It was an act of service so intimate, so completely stripped of grand declaration, that it struck her harder than any spoken vow ever could. He had given her the morning. He had given her warmth. She pushed the heavy quilts aside. For the first time in months, she did not violently shiver as her feet touched the floorboards. The wood was pleasantly warm, heated by the ambient radiation of the roaring hearth. She stood pulling her woolen shawl around her shoulders out of habit rather than necessity and walked across the room. He heard her approach. The steady scraping of the knife paused. He did not jump, nor did he offer a beaming smile. He simply turned his head, his dark eyes catching the firelight, and watched her step into the golden radius of the hearth. Elara stopped beside him. She looked down at the fire, then at the steaming iron kettle. She did not know how to articulate the sheer magnitude of what this meant to her. The words felt clumsy and insufficient in her mouth. She swallowed hard, gathering her composure. He did not force her to speak. He set the knife and the carved pine aside on the stones. He reached out with a calloused hand, took a thick piece of canvas cloth, and lifted the boiling kettle from the iron hook. With his other hand, he retrieved 2 battered tin cups from the wooden table. He poured the dark, steaming liquid into both cups, the rich aroma blooming wildly in the heated air. He handed the first cup to her. Elara took it. Her fingers brushed the rough, warm skin of his knuckles. A quiet shock traveled up her arm, settling deep in her chest. She wrapped both hands around the hot tin, letting the heat seep into her palms. He took his own cup and leaned back against the stone facade of the fireplace. He took a slow drink, his eyes looking past her out the frosted window toward the lightening sky above the mountains. They stood together in the quiet cabin, bathed in the warmth he had built from the ashes. The violent, unforgiving world of the Montana winter still raged somewhere beyond the log walls. But in this room, the frost had been entirely broken. Elara brought the tin cup to her lips, inhaling the steam, and drank. The bitter, earthy taste of the chicory grounded her in the present moment. She looked at the man beside her, at the quiet strength in his jaw and the steady rhythm of his breathing. The ice in her chest, a glacier that had been forming for 2 solitary years, finally began to melt. The days that followed the great whiteout established a new rhythmic pulse on the homestead. The desperate edge of survival had softened into a steady shared labor. The bitter cold remained a constant creeping predator, looking for a crack in the timber, but the heavy dread of facing it alone had vanished from Elara's shoulders. They moved around each other in the small cabin and the snowy yard with an unspoken choreography. Where she carried the water, he chopped the wood. Where she mended the harnesses, he reinforced the stable doors. They were 2 solitary gears, perfectly meshed in the harsh machinery of the frontier. It happened on the 5th morning, after the sky cleared. The sun was a blinding pale disk, burning against an expanse of endless aching blue. Elara stood by the pump, the heavy iron handle freezing through the thick leather of her gloves. She was filling the water troughs when the wind shifted, carrying a sound from the deep timber at the edge of the property line. It was a sharp, pathetic bleat. She dropped the wooden bucket. The water splashed over her boots, instantly turning to a thin sheet of ice. She turned her head, narrowing her eyes against the glare of the snow. Down in the gully where the drifts had piled up into sheer white walls against the pine trees, a dark shape was thrashing. It was one of the late-season calves, a foolish, stubborn yearling that had somehow wandered past the fence line before the storm hit and survived by sheltering deep in the brush. Now trying to find its way back to the herd, it had stepped blindly into a buried ravine. The snow was up to its neck. It was hopelessly trapped, kicking frantically against the packed ice, slowly exhausting whatever small reserve of heat it had left. Elara did not shout. She turned back toward the barn, breaking into a heavy run through the cleared trench. By the time she reached the stable doors to grab a coil of thick hemp rope, he was already there. He had heard the cry. He carried a broad, flat-nosed iron shovel over his shoulder. He took one look at her face, then followed her pointing finger toward the tree line. He nodded once. The rescue had begun. They left the safety of the cleared paths and plunged into the unbroken powder. Every step was a brutal negotiation with the mountain. The snow was thigh-deep, hiding treacherous rocks and fallen branches beneath its pristine surface. Elara led the way, using her body weight to break the crust, her breath burning like swallowed glass in her throat. When she stumbled, her muscles screaming in protest, he moved past her without a word, taking the lead using his broad shoulders to carve a trench through the heavy drift. When they finally reached the gully, the calf was failing. Its bleats had turned into weak, ragged gasps. Its dark coat was matted with ice, and its eyes rolled back in pure, freezing terror. The snow around it was packed solid by its frantic struggling. They descended into the ravine. The cold down here was a physical weight pooling in the depression, where the sun could not reach. He stepped right up to the thrashing animal, speaking to it in a low, rhythmic cadence that Elara did not understand. The tone was ancient, a deep, steady vibration that cut through the panic. The calf stopped kicking, turning its head toward him. He began to dig. He did not use the shovel to chop wildly. He used it to expertly shear away the hard-packed walls of the snow trap, giving the animal room to breathe. Elara fell to her knees beside him, using her gloved hands to claw the loose powder away from the calf's buried legs. The snow soaked through her heavy leather gloves, the freezing wetness biting deep into her skin. But she did not stop. She could feel the animal's violent shivering through the ice. "The rope," he said. It was the first time she had heard his voice clearly in days. It was gravelly low and perfectly calm. She uncoiled the heavy hemp, her fingers clumsy and numb. She passed the looped end to him. He leaned over the buried animal, burying his arms elbow deep into the freezing snow to pass the rope beneath its chest behind its front legs. He secured the knot with a sharp practice pull. He stood moving to the top of the drift, taking the slack of the rope. He looked down at Elara. She positioned herself behind the calf, planting her boots as firmly as she could in the slippery snow, ready to push. He gave a sharp nod. They moved together. He leaned back, his boots digging into the ice, and pulled with a sudden explosive exertion of power. The thick muscles in his back and shoulders strained against the buckskin. At the exact same second, Elara shoved her entire weight against the calf's hindquarters. The animal scrambled its hooves, seeking purchase on the hard ice he had exposed. For a terrible moment, they were at a standstill, the dead weight of the calf fighting against their combined strength. Then the snow broke. The calf lunged upward, surging out of the pit with a frantic kick, stumbling over the lip of the ravine and collapsing onto the level ground. It lay there for a second, shaking its head before scrambling upright and trotting unsteadily back toward the safety of the distant barn. They had won. Elara slumped against the snowy wall of the ravine. Her chest heaved, pulling the sharp, freezing air into her lungs. Her arms felt completely drained of blood, trembling violently from the exertion. She pulled her wet, freezing leather gloves from her hands, tossing them onto the snow. Her knuckles were stark wide, stiff, and aching with a brutal, throbbing pain. She rubbed her bare hands together, trying to force the circulation back into her fingers. Her head bowed as she caught her breath. A shadow fell over her. He dropped the rope and stepped down the slight incline, stopping right in front of her. She looked up. His chest was heaving with the same rhythmic exertion, his dark hair falling across his forehead. He looked down at her bare, trembling hands. He took off his own heavy hide mittens, tucking them beneath his arm. He dropped to one knee in the snow, bringing himself to her eye level. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not offer empty, comforting words. He reached out. His bare hands closed over hers. The shock of it stopped the breath in her throat. His skin was rough, heavily calloused from a lifetime of hard labor, yet it carried an incredible radiating heat. It was like holding a living ember. He wrapped his large hands completely around her small, freezing ones, pressing the warmth of his palms deeply into her aching knuckles. He held them firmly, a steady anchoring pressure that chased the bitter cold away from her bones. Elara sat perfectly still in the frozen ravine. The howling silence of the Montana winter vanished. There was only the sound of his steady breathing, the rising heat of his skin, and the terrifying, beautiful realization that the distance between them had just collapsed. She looked into his dark eyes, and he looked back. There was no hesitation in his gaze, only a quiet, absolute certainty. It was not a grand romance born of poetry. It was a bond forged in the freezing mud, sealed by the simple, profound act of keeping the other warm. He held her hands until the color returned to her fingers. Then he slowly let go. He stood up, picked up the shovel, and offered her his hand to help her rise. She took it, letting him pull her up from the snow. They walked back to the cabin together, their shoulders brushing in the narrow trench, the icy wind no longer possessing the power to make her shiver. The siege of winter did not end with a sudden triumphant trumpet blast. It surrendered in a million tiny weeping droplets. It started on the southern pitch of the cabin roof. A single rhythmic tapping against the frozen mud of the yard began at dawn. By noon, the wooden eaves were running with crystal water, carving shallow, muddy rivers through the towering white drifts. The air lost its razor edge. It no longer smelled of dry ice and desperation. It smelled of wet pine needles thawing black earth, and the sweet resinous sap of the great evergreens waking from their long sleep. Elara stood on the porch, leaning against the rough-hewn timber of the support beam. She had pushed the heavy oak door wide open, letting the cool, damp breeze flush the stale smoke from the single room. The mountain was shedding its armor. Down in the valley, the frozen creek cracked a sound, like a distant rifle shot, signaling the rush of water beneath the thick ice. The brutal, suffocating whiteout that had nearly claimed both of their lives felt like a ghost story told in another lifetime. The mountain passes were clear. The snowpack had hardened, and the winding trails leading down to the settlements and the wide southern plains were navigable once more. The unspoken law of the frontier dictated that shelter was temporary, a vital debt owed to the storm and paid in split wood and mended fences. But the man had not packed his heavy woolen blanket. He had not laced his tall moccasins for a long journey. Instead, he had taken the heavy iron plowshare from the darkest corner of the stable and begun honing its rusted edge against a circular whetstone. He was preparing for the earth to soften. He was preparing to turn the soil. There had been no grand conversation. There had been no tearful confessions by the hearth or desperate pleas to stay. The frontier did not breed such fragile things. Their bond had been forged in the freezing mud, hammered out on the oak chopping block, and sealed in the shared, exhausting labor of keeping each other alive. He stayed because the woodbox needed filling. He stayed because the roof needed patching. He stayed because somewhere in the endless blinding white of the blizzard, his solitary path had irrevocably merged with hers. The cabin felt entirely different now. It was no longer a wooden box built to keep death at bay. It breathed. It held a steady grounding weight. That evening, as the blue twilight settled over the thawing valley, they sat together by a fire that was built for comfort, not for desperate survival. Elara worked a bone needle through heavy canvas, repairing a torn grain sack. He sat in the low wooden chair opposite her, quietly oiling the leather of a heavy draft bridle. The only sounds were the crackle of the burning pine, the soft hiss of the melting snow outside, and the rhythmic comforting scrape of his cloth against the worn leather. She watched him beneath her eyelashes. She watched the steady, capable movement of his large hands. She watched the way the amber firelight caught the strong, sharp angles of his jaw and the dark, quiet depth of his eyes. He looked up, catching her gaze across the hearth. He did not look away. The silence between them was not empty. It was full. It was a heavy, rich tapestry woven from 100 unspoken moments of shared endurance. A slow, subtle softening reached his eyes, a gentle crinkling at the corners that held more genuine affection than 1,000 spoken sonnets. When Elara woke the next morning, the cabin was shrouded in the soft slate-gray light of early dawn. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing ruby embers in the grate. The air in the room was pleasantly cool, but it entirely lacked the vicious, biting cruelty of the deep winter. She did not have to brace herself against the morning. She did not have to gather her courage to face the freezing dark. There was a heavy, radiating heat pressed against her back. She lay perfectly still, her breath catching softly in her throat. The feather ticking dipped under a solid, anchoring weight. A strong, heavily muscled arm was draped casually over her waist, the rough, calloused palm resting gently against her stomach beneath the heavy quilts. She could feel the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest against her spine. The Apache was asleep beside her. He had not risen early to fight the frost. He had not left her to face the dawn alone. He had simply crossed the final physical expanse of the cabin and claimed his quiet place by her side. His breathing was slow and deep, a soothing vibration that resonated through her own ribs. The scent of him, wood smoke, old leather, and the wild, clean rain of the thaw enveloped her entirely. Elara closed her eyes. The pristine, staggering relief that washed over her was so powerful, it brought a hot prickle of tears to her eyelashes. She reached down, resting her small, pale hand over his dark, weather-beaten fingers. He shifted slightly in his sleep, his arm tightening instinctively around her, pulling her closer into the absolute safety of his chest. The long, brutal winter was finally over. The frost on the glass had melted away. The crushing, silent isolation of the claim was broken, banished forever by the steady beat of a second heart. She had fought the bitter cold for 2 solitary years, but she knew with an unshakable certainty that she would never wake up freezing again. The Apache had made her morning warm. The frontier asks for everything a person has, and in return, it offers only the truth of who they are when the fire dies down. Some bonds are spoken loudly into the wind, but the strongest are built in the quiet dark, proven through the hardest seasons. If this story of silent resilience and quiet devotion resonates with the unspoken spaces in your own life, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us how you recognize true partnership when the winter sets in, and join us again as we explore the enduring echoes of the West.